So good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here for the 6 out of 6 workshop, the last workshop of the Dare UK program that we've been running over the month of March. This is the workshop on core federation services. Certainly a very important component of what we're trying to do here at Dare UK. As normal, I suppose what we're going to do, and maybe for some of you who we've seen, there's some familiar faces and familiar names in the call. This will be a little bit repetitive for you, but we will do, as a normal, introduction to the program, those who are not aware of the program. And Hans-Erik Aronson, who's the director of the Dare UK program, will take us through that. And then we'll be handing over to Jerry Riley, who's the design authority for the Dare UK program, to take us through basically the topic for today and the recommendations around core federation services. Before I hand over to Hans-Erik, I do just want to quickly, and I'll share my screen shortly, but just a short reminder to everyone around sort of the house rules for these sort of calls. We're looking for your feedback. We're looking for constructive and robust and challenging discussions from all of you. These are very much draft recommendations from us. And we're really looking for input from all of you, and we're excited to get input from all of you. So this is just a reminder of the house rules for the call, and also when we go into the breakout rooms later, just to make sure that we're all playing well together. Great. I think then with that, Hans-Erik, I'll hand the ball over to you.
Thank you, Fergus. Okay, I'm Hans-Erik Aronson. I'm the director of Dare UK Phase 1. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what Dare UK is all about. Next slide, please. So Dare UK is a program that is pan-UKRI. The aim of the program is to establish a step change in the national research capability for secure sharing, linkage, and analysis of sensitive data for research and innovation, both at pace and at scale. It spans all 7 councils, Innovate UK and Research England, so all components of UKRI. Next slide, please. Dare UK is a multi-phase, multi-year program. We are in phase 1 right now, design and dialogue. It is to be followed by a second phase, build, test, and establish, and a third phase, deliver, optimize, and federate. These are sort of the motifs of each phase. Basically, in this first phase, this is an extensive program of community engagement with researchers, technologists, and the public, culminating in a co-design blueprint for the next generation of trusted research environments, with standards, access, accreditation, and ethics policies based on trustworthiness, security, and interoperability. After this phase, then, we are launching phase 2, which we're going to test some of these concepts more deeply, and in phase 3, you can think of that as more of a scale-up phase, where we really work on the federation part of this to create an ecosystem of TREs. Next slide, please. So, what question is Dare UK Phase 1 trying to answer? The question we're answering is how should national secure and interoperable digital research infrastructure and associated services be designed and implemented to connect and analyze complex, sensitive, and often unconsented data from across disciplines and sectors in a flexible, efficient, and sustainable fashion. Health Data Research UK, HDR UK, and Administrative Data Research UK, ADR UK, were jointly commissioned by UKRI to undertake phase 1 of this program. The delivery team is based at HDR UK, but the program is actually jointly managed by HDR and ADR UK. Next slide, please. So we're starting from a number of assumptions. The Dare UK is predicated on those assumptions. Namely, we're not starting from scratch. Each research council already has established data infrastructures and data research use cases that are opportunities for best practices in each of these councils that we believe could be adopted more broadly. We believe that this is a federated infrastructure is technically feasible. It is ethically and legally feasible and would be trusted by the public. We believe that funding and time envelope can be sustained for this enterprise. And we believe that there's strong buy-in from the research councils, the government, the data custodians, and the researchers for this kind of approach to analyzing sensitive data. Next slide, please. In the fall of last year, we started off phase one with a landscape review. We spoke to technologists, researchers, and other stakeholders across the UK. During the landscape review, we identified 6 themes that we have. We're holding these workshops according to all of the 6 themes, and the last one today is one dealing with digital research infrastructure. The themes, however, were data and discoverability, access and accreditation, capability and capacity building, demonstrating trustworthiness, funding and incentives, and then largely here, lastly, the digital research infrastructure, which is kind of the nuts and bolts of how TREs are operating. Next slide, please. So we are operating under, we have some processes and deliverables in place here. The teal colored hexagons in the center of this diagram are the 6 areas that we identified in the landscape review. The way that the processes we're following are public and stakeholder engagement, and also a series of sprint exemplar projects that are underway right now. They started at the beginning of January and will end at the end of August when this phase ends. They will be part of informing the blueprint that we're going to, the co-developed blueprint that I mentioned earlier, that this was mentioned in the right margin here. There's one of the deliverables, as well as these workshops and other stakeholder engagements. All of these things will feed into our blueprint. Apart from the blueprint, we will provide a detailed delivery plan for phase 2, as well as an outline of a delivery plan for phase 3, and a business case for UKRI to pursue Dare UK at scale and bring this forward into other latter phases. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Dare UK is a multi-phase, multi-year program. You can see the 3 phases again in the right margin here. The key targets of this program is public. We do this for public benefit. The researchers, data custodians, and the TRE community. These are all key stakeholders in this program. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to present the team. This is the program delivery team. I'm the program director. Also on this call, you have Jerry Riley, the design authority, Sushil Varma, technical lead, Michelle Amugi, the program manager, Fergus McDonald, who's our senior program manager, and Lizzie Wayne, who's our senior communications and engagement manager. Lucy Gold, our senior business partner, is not on this call. I included 3 links at the bottom of this slide to the Dare UK website, the initial landscape review that we conducted in the fall, and as well as details on the sprint exemplar projects that are ongoing. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jerry Riley.
Thank you, Hans-Erik, and welcome. Let me just share my screen so we can get started on the discussion. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. Can I just have a quick thumbs up from somebody? Okay, thank you. Okay, so welcome to the 6th of our workshop. So really pleased to see everybody. And I am particularly impressed with those of you who I've noticed have actually managed to make all 6 of the workshops. So I'm providing incredibly valuable input to us. You will have noticed that we renamed it. If you were planning to come to the Digital Research Infrastructure Workshop, you are in the right place. We made a decision to do a little bit of renaming from the themes that came out from the landscape review, because the Dare UK programme is part of the UKRI wider digital research infrastructure work. And we felt that that actually was confusing for us to have a theme that's also related to our overarching programme within UKRI. So view this as the workshop that's looking at the technical glue. So we are going to go down in some of the recommendations into a bit more technical depth than in some of the previous workshops, but I still believe everybody, whether you're a deeply technical person or you're coming from the policy point of view or from a public point of view, there's incredible valuable insight that you can bring to this. So hopefully as I go through the slides, I'll be able to give enough of a discussion of the concepts that everybody feels comfortable. Just share your views. There's no wrong views here. I am going to present slightly differently to the previous workshops in that I am going to pause briefly for questions and clarification after each of the recommendations. That's not to take out of the breakout sessions the valuable discussion we'll have later, but it is, I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for any questions so that we can immediately look at those. And those themselves will also be useful. So this is really about how we make this concept of a federation of trusted research environments work in practice. So in the previous workshops, we've looked at really important areas of trustworthiness, of data and discovery, of funding and incentives, of access and accreditation, and capacity building. Now I want to look at the depth. So the core aims of the DARE UK programme are around design and delivery of a UK-wide infrastructure, the building of a next generation of trusted research environments. And I think that's about also not just the building, but the building efficiently. We're building these largely with public money, and therefore we need to be able to build these in a way that can be done securely and effectively, but also in a cost-effective manner as well. So we make great use of public funds. Making sure that our researchers can effectively use that network and address practical use cases, and to enable and enhance research on sensitive data from across the UK. So today's discussion is really about what do we need to do technically to make this a reality. So what do we need to do technically in phase 2 to really pilot what we do here, and in phase 3 to make this a production capable network to support world-class research on sensitive data from across the UK and across the UK RI councils. So what do we mean by a TRE? So today we're going to look at some of more of the technical elements, but I just wanted, particularly for those who haven't been on the previous workshops or less exposed perhaps to the concept of a trusted research environment, to just touch briefly on what we mean by a TRE. So we are seeing a move, and I think that's been validated quite strongly over the last few years, but particularly with really key investments like the 200 million into the NHS work around trusted research environments, in a move to research on sensitive data, work on sensitive data, occurring within secure, auditable environments with access to health data and other sensitive data, rather than that data being traveling out to being analyzed in other research environments, other perhaps less secure or perhaps less auditable research environments, so out to the researchers' own systems, own desktops. So this is about building secure, safe, trustworthy environments where we can prove that and progressively enhance that security. It's about building out around 5 concepts that we call the 5 safes, which originated with the ONS and have been refined out as a really good framework. So it's around safe people, so being able to validate that only trained and appropriately accredited researchers can access the data. So the research is only being conducted by people who are valid researchers demonstrably doing research for the public good, projects that have been through an ethical approval to ensure that the research is being conducted for clear public benefit, that the research environments, and this will be particularly pertinent to today's discussions, itself is secure, and that the data won't leave the environment, and that we can audit that security. And for those of you who were on yesterday's workshop, we would build out a formalized approach for accreditation of trusted research environments, so that we can regularly demonstrate that that security is there, and progress and continuous improvement and enhancement to that security. That the data itself, safe data, has been appropriately de-identified to protect privacy, and that we make use of the latest advances around de-identification, privacy enhancing technologies, and that we check that the data, that the information that is disclosed from the environment is not disclosive about the individual level data, but really is the research outputs around graphs, tables that are there for research publication, and that there is a rigorous approach to checking those outputs to ensure that identifiable and disclosive information is never output from the trusted research environments. So these are really the concepts, the characteristics of what we expect from a trusted research environment. Less at the level of exactly how you build one, but more about how it should look from the outside. So in today's discussion, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we want to look at potentially as technical activities over the next phase of the DARE UK programme. So our first set of draft recommendations, and as Hans-Erik mentioned in his introduction, these are still very much draft recommendations. We're still very early in discussion, so we really want to hear thoughts and views, and they will get refined. They won't look like this when we get there. So one of the things we would like to see is the development of a reference architecture for trusted research environments. What do we mean by reference architecture? Essentially a recipe. We see a lot of TREs being built at this stage. There's some brilliantly run, well-established ones, but we're seeing new ones emerge. And if we don't have a common approach, or at least a baseline common approach, we're going through the expense of lots of people thinking, building their own. It's also very difficult to be sure what best practices are. So we'd like to build out a recipe, a reference architecture for TREs that could be deployed on-premise or to public cloud, that fits with best practice around the five states using open source technology, and to have an implementation of that is ready to go, or perhaps more than one implementation. So we think having a reference architecture is important, and that will allow us to both propagate good best practice, but also to ensure that we get value for money for public investment, so that people have something they can reuse. So that's really our concept that we talk about as a TR in a box, something that can be spun up that we know has good practice. It doesn't mean that you can just spin this up and it's ready to go. You're still going to have to be able to manage this properly. You're still going to have the skills and capabilities to ensure that you're running a good environment, but it will give you a good starting point. Building upon that, in 1B is what we talk about as a pop-up TRE. This is a concept that I think originally came out of some of our colleagues at SAIL. And the concept of a pop-up TRE is that there are some use cases where you can't just do federated analysis. You can't ship the federation out to the data, which is what we'd ideally like to do. We want to minimize data travel. But you've got to bring the data together in one place at least for a period of time. So you want to be able to do that securely. So you want to be able to build effectively a TRE on the fly, where if I'm bringing data together from maybe 2 or more TREs, they still own the responsibility. They can still pull the plug on that TRE in a collective way, but that we will bring this together in one of the TREs for analysis. And then once the analysis has occurred, the aggregated data will be deleted, will just remain in there in the original host TREs. So it's allowing us to do that aggregation where we need to do that aggregation, but within an environment that has all the characteristics of a trusted research environment. The third element of this first recommendation is around making sure we can connect out our TRE capability for those use cases which have need for large-scale compute provisioning. So there is major investment going on around large-scale compute. We want to make sure that as we build out a federated network of TREs, that plays nicely into the large-scale compute. And finally, one of the use cases, and it may be a little bit niche, it's one where we probably have to think about whether it's the right thing to invest in at this stage. As we went through the landscape review, we heard a need from a couple of groups of needing very high scale but very intermittent access to compute. So tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cores of compute, maybe for minutes or hours. So this probably is not something you address through provisioning on premise, but we heard a desire to be able to provision this through high scale public cloud, but for very short periods of time. And there are approaches to doing this within public cloud. So we would want to explore piloting the ability to spin up very high scale compute environments on public cloud for very small periods, short periods of time. And to do this as a service, because it requires both specific technical skills, but also business relationships, which probably are not, each group probably doesn't want to build individually, but it's probably better provided by a service that can be made available across the UKRI research landscape. So with that, I'm just going to pause for a moment to allow any questions. I mean, Fergus, could you facilitate here? Because as I'm screen sharing, I can't actually see the chat.
That's fine, Jerry, no worries. There's nothing in the chat as yet, but feel free to just raise your hand or come in if there's any questions.
Okay, if not, I'm going to go on to the next one. Okay, so the next one is around high availability, business continuity, disaster recovery. So this whole set of things of how do we make our infrastructure, and by infrastructure, I mean the whole network of federated TREs that might exist conceptually in the future, more resilient. So, and more resilient in a way, again, that we can do that in a sustainable way, making good use of public funding. So the first thing we want to be able to do is actually understand where we are today. Because we have some great infrastructures out there, the work that's been done in Swansea, ONS, the Edinburgh team, NHS Digital. There's some really great environments out there that will have some elements of these, perhaps all elements of these already. So we want to be able to understand where we are, but also where we are with the new environments that are being spun up. So where are we around the potential impacts? But also, if we are building a federated network, does this afford us some opportunity to actually do failover across the network so that we can actually build more resilience than we have today? Because we have trust, we have accreditation between environments, subject of yesterday's workshop, we have the ability, fast communications between environments, common identity management. So can we do things differently? Can we look at things differently? So here we're looking, so we're looking to guard against several different failure scenarios. So that's something we want to look at. So this could be local failures of storage and compute, which are probably well covered in most environments that have on-premise capability around high availability. But again, sharing best practice is always good. It's around making us less vulnerable to the sort of ransomware attacks, of making sure that we have backups across the network, reproduction across the network, so that should a site be subject to a ransomware attack or something similar, or distributed denial of service type attacks takes out an environment, we have some resilience against it. But also, we do need the resilience. We have some key environments, and we need the resilience to deal with a total loss of an environment. This may be highly unlikely, but if we were to lose one of the major infrastructures, the damage this does to research in the UK is extremely high. So we need to look at how we would make a future network provide us with a better capability to deal with it. And for those who don't believe this occurs, contact me later and I'll send you a video. Much earlier in my career, I worked in an environment. I was out the office the day it occurred, but we lost the building to a fire. That took out a whole modern building in a amazingly short period of time. So whilst the scenario may sound as if it's a really low likelihood of occurrence, it does occur, and we, as a research community, we need that resilience. So I'm going to pause for a moment on that one to let Fergus throw questions in.
So I'm just looking at the chat here. There was one comment from Will, I hope I'm saying your surname correctly, Crocombe. Basically, might need some thought over these being regarded as data transfers, but perhaps not if using CMKs. I don't know, Will, if you want to perhaps clarify that or just add a bit.
Just simply that the idea of shunting data around to improve resilience is a fantastic idea. I was just wondering, from a governance perspective, data that has moved perhaps to a different data controller, which might create some problems. But if you're encrypting and managing the keys properly, perhaps you could get around it. It was just some thinking out loud, really.
No, it's a really good question. And when you get to your breakout room, can you slam that one on the Jamboard? It is actually a discussion we've started to have, and as we were going to do the run through on the slides yesterday before we did this, we actually had a bit of debate about including some more discussion on the governance elements as well as the technical elements. As we look at resilience over the network, we will have to look at the question of how we get the governance to work well with this. And as you say, there are technical approaches to doing this that should fit with that, but we will need to make sure the technical and governance lines up appropriately so that we can actually make secure use of this.
Yep. There's another question here from Andy, but maybe Andy, to yours, we can leave that for the end of the session. Then Jerry could maybe give a bit more insight on what happened and where it happened. So I think that's it for now, unless there's any hands from anybody. I don't think so, Jerry. Go ahead.
Next one. So as I characterized at the beginning, this is about building the glue to make that federated network a reality. I'm not, and I very deliberately chose not to, going to cover which services need to be rolled out over what period of time. That I think needs a much deeper technical discussion, and we'll be looking for some discussions around that. I wanted to more set some recommendations around principles, and these are things that take through to hopefully to UKRI a bit later on this summer. we see a need to build out a common open API to support the core federation services, and that is properly managed as an open source project under a proper framework. We think to make this a federation, it needs to be an open implementation. It needs to be a community managed so that there isn't a lock-in. As we discussed in the introduction, as Hans-Erik mentioned, this is also about building from what already exists. We're not starting from scratch. There are some really good elements of this already out there. So it's about looking at what's there, adopting what's already there, but bringing that into a consistent library of APIs. But it's also about, during phase 2 and into phase 3, building out testers for it. Everything we do here, and I'll touch on it a bit more on the next slide actually, everything we do here needs to be validated. We shouldn't be doing anything for just technology's sake. So as we go into building out these services, we want to be able to test that they actually meet the use cases that we're trying to achieve. So we want, as we build this out, we've got to have a proof of concept driving this. And we want to be able to look at how we use this to build, for example, portable analytics workspaces that can be deployed across the environment. And we're well aware there are already some pilot projects out there looking at elements of this. So to a large extent, what I think this is about convening and bringing those together and making sure that we actually come out of this with a usable API, usable projects that can be readily deployed into existing environments with a relatively low barrier to entry, and across new environments and new infrastructures as they get brought on stream. And I'm going to pause there. I see James Hetherington. Hi, James has raised his hand, who will definitely have some thoughts and views on this, I know.
No, so I think this is fantastic. And apart from anything else, is how can we help, Jerry? But more specifically, here's what I'm worried about. I really want to be able to see this vision flourish across all the research institutions and higher education institutions in the UK. We are all doing things to kind of meet urgent need around trusted research environments and data safe havens within our institutions. And what I fear is making a lock-in decision for a particular local next generation TRE within my institution, which is then harder to build back into the federated vision that you're describing. We're probably at some point in the next year or two going to deploy either the Manchester Imperial AWS solution or the Turing Azure solution, or maybe an outgrowth of our existing on-prem infrastructure. I don't know, but something new, right, as a next generation TRE. And I want to make sure that it can make take benefit from all this work without locking us into another different legacy story. So how do we address that challenge?
So that's a really good topic for discussion, James, because people are making decisions. Some of those will be decisions that effectively become, I'm trying to avoid the lock-in phrase a little bit, but could be lock-in decisions. So as we look at this at the next technical level, one of the things I would be keen to be able to do is design an API layers actually, where we can intercept into the common infrastructures that already exist. Now, technically tough. Those of us who weaned ourselves on trying to do interoperability between distributed computing environments from OSF and Sun lived and died this from 10 years ago. But we can't, as you said, people are having to make decisions today.
Yeah.
I want to move fast on this as we go into phase 2. We need the really quite significant investment to do this, but we can't turn around to people and say, pause for the next 12 months while we get our ideas together.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
That's just not practical. So there is going to need to be an element of here is a reference, here is the API level, here is a reference implementation. Let's see how we do intercepts where we can do intercepts.
Great,
But
that sounds brilliant.
Let James really make sure you get that one on Jamboard, because that's one we need to probably cover in some depth as we do the write-up.
Great. I think that's it. I do see, Will, you've put a comment in, but I think probably more a comment than maybe a question for the moment. We can just carry that through to the breakout room as well.
Yeah.
I think James responding to Will, so that's fine. And
the comments are really useful, so please, yes, we'll slam them on Jamboard, but we will be saving the chat. So, and I knew in today's session we'd end up with some of that discussion in the main session as well as the latter section. So the fourth one, and a fourth, it is probably the easier one, and it builds on what I said on the previous slide, which is we're not building for technology's sake here. We're actually going to avoid, quite honestly, I think our recommendations are going to be to avoid building as much as possible and to take what's already there, assemble from what's already there, reuse the great work. However, we need to make sure that what we are doing is valid, that we're not just building out a really interesting set of services because we're technologists and this is fun, but we're doing this because there are tractable cross-council use cases that would benefit from doing this, that it will either make use cases that can't be got to today possible, or at least make them considerably easier to do than we're doing today. So we're going to make a recommendation that as part of phase 2, we'll probably work in both phase 2 and phase 3 of the DARE program, that there should be a competitive call for driver projects that would use the new infrastructure and would act as ways of validating the work that's going on. Now, some of these might be small, they might be more major, but we think that that's a core element of any of this work, because otherwise there is a real danger that we could spend considerable time and effort building out services that actually really don't meet tractable needs. So we think that having a small number of driver projects that run through the next 2 phases of the program that validate what we're doing is really, really essential. So with that, I am going to stop sharing.
So I do see we have a hand from James Hetherington again, Jerry. And James, feel free.
Thanks very much. So this point about reusing what's going on already in the community rather than doing, and avoiding novel development to achieve this where possible is of course correct. What I fear for the community is we all get quite attached to the projects we've done within our individual institutions. I think we might need some kind of concordat to say, I would prefer to delete my code rather than be another fork in a fork war, or be yet another copy of my own thing. I think working open will be really vital to ensuring the community coheres around as small a number of code bases to instantiate TREs as possible. I would far rather do the work to make the particular things that we're excited about in UCL ensuring as pull requests against shared code bases that are open to the community than otherwise. And I think some kind of shared commitment of the community working on TREs to hold our sunk costs lightly when it comes to work we've all been doing, and get together to drive down the number of forks would be a good thing for the community to do.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, James. It will not be easy. You're absolutely correct. We all have passion, and therefore there is a natural, indeed laudable tendency to want to really champion what we've done. And that will be true around the API level, because there's already a number of different implementations of a number of the services that I would envisage us wanting to build out, and obviously also around reference architecture for TREs. We are going to have to do some coming together here, and one of the reasons I actually and today, as we get into the breakout rooms, I'd really like to run some elements of this under an established open source framework rather than, okay, let's just put it on GitHub approach, is because then we can put a committee around this of people who come from divergent areas and say, right, actually, we'll all work together, but we're going to run it under the Apache Software Foundation or whatever. We're going to pick one, we're going to run it properly, it will have open source governance and not just, people who know me know, I don't believe dumping stuff on GitHub is open source. Dumping stuff is about governance and having quite structure around it, as well as making your code available. And therefore, as we do this, I really want it to be done as under a proper established framework with proper governance, but also so that those who have conflicting passionate ideas can all be contributing in a managed way together.
Great. So we're a little tight on time, so I'm going to go with Ollie. Yeah. Ollie's got his hand up, and then we'll close it there. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll be quick. So you've spoken a lot about sort of federated API stuff. Can I check what's the scope on that? I mean, the things you're talking about, spinning up environments, and I'm guessing, user access and all of this sort of stuff. What about that sort of federated analytics side of thing? Do you see that sitting as part of this federated API work?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Ultimately, Ollie, I do see part of the services that we need to be providing as providing the ability to do workload deployment out in a managed way across the federation of TREs, which would support a variety of models of federated analytics. I don't see, and there's an interesting debate on scope, I don't see the scope for what Dare UK should be doing as building that federated analytics. I think it's about building the services that are required to support an approach to federated analytics. So the layer below, I think the federated analytics are for those who want to do federated analytics, and there are people who are great at this. I don't see that as where we should be going up into, but we do need to be able to build out infrastructure and APIs that can do workload deployment, trusted execution across the network to support that federated analytics layer.
Okay. All right.
But again, open to conflicting and different thoughts and ideas as we go through the breakout rooms.
Great. Thanks for the question, Ollie.
Yeah.
All right. So thanks for the questions. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the breakout rooms, and then we're sort of basically going to have a bit of a deeper discussion, and we have a couple of jam boards that your moderators will take you through, where hopefully we can capture a lot of your thoughts. And then we will come back after we've got into the breakout rooms. We'll come back round about 11:30 into the main room, do a short sort of recap, and maybe have some final questions, clarifications, discussions before we close it. All right, then without further ado, Michelle, Lizzie, if you can fire us all off into our rooms, please. Good to have everyone back in the main room. Thanks for all the discussions, and thanks to my group as well for all the discussion. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to go through, so each of sort of the moderators are just going to talk through some of the key points from the discussions that we've just had in the breakout rooms. And then we'll have, time willing, we will have some room for discussion at the end, some clarification, comments, questions before we close the call. Normally, because I have the mic, I would start, but I think for today, I'm going to probably lob the ball over actually to Jerry to kick us off, if Jerry's okay with that.
Jerry's okay with that, so I'll keep it brief. There's a lot of really good discussions. So we obviously started the discussion around the sort of reference architecture recipes piece. So again, general perspective is that we need to do this, because if we don't do this, there'll be lots of solutions. They won't necessarily be interoperable. We will be investing in lots of different times in reinventing the wheel. So we need to do the work around reference architectures and making sure that that's done in a very open way and led in a very structured way. One of the things that did come through very strongly around this was, though, that this shouldn't just be around the technical elements of the reference architecture. If we're going to build a reference architecture, we should also think through what should be the common elements around governance and processes and things like that. So there's a package that isn't just a technical package. There's a package that provides best practice and approaches that spans the technical and the very essential wraparound that's needed to be able to deploy TREs in an effective way that meets the principles of the 5 SAFEs. We had some discussion around the broad high availability business continuity disaster recovery space, and there was some interesting observation there that people have been involved in conversations, and this has rarely been raised as a problem. Yes, there's discussion around what you do with backups and things like that, but there didn't appear to have been many conversations where the sort of more dramatic issues of things like your ransomware attack or your building burning down type scenarios were gone through. So there was a question of, have we really been looking at this one? Have we really thought it through? Which I think somewhat validates perhaps the first sub recommendation of, we just need to spend some time thinking this one through before jumping in necessarily to doing things, but we do need to see where we are. And are we hiding from the fact that we actually run at quite high risk if we were to lose a major infrastructure? We also have discussion a little bit of how could public cloud play into this, because great having failover over our federated network of TREs. It's unlikely that other TREs, should we have lost an infrastructure, will have capacity in terms of headroom on compute and things like that. Can we do some smart things around cloud that would allow us to, in a failure scenario, make better use of public cloud? So that was a comment that came through. Good discussion around the principles approaches to APIs, and that we need to develop these out. And again, a discussion around ensuring that this is done with appropriate governance, but also done in a way where those who are responsible for the environments, those who are responsible in existing environments, have confidence that what is being done is secure and valid to the level that they can sell it to their communities. There is no point in us building out an API layer unless we can build confidence that that will get deployed into those environments and is trusted by those who have responsibility for running the important research infrastructures that exist. So so that build out needs to be done in collaboration with those communities. Then we touched on the use cases. So really important to build out cross-sectorial use cases that test out core functionality, that really test that the basics work. Don't just touch on the edge cases, but really make sure the basics and central capabilities are solid. But also, these take time. If we're going to test out concepts that require us to deploy APIs into environments, the experience of projects like CoConnect has been that this might take longer. So sprints are great, but it may need longer use cases if we're going to have time to properly validate what we're doing, because otherwise the technical elements of this may not be so challenging, but the governance definitely is. And that a little bit was a theme that came through on across all 4 sets of recommendations, was that don't trivialize what's needed technically, but the governance elements of this, the wider social engineering elements of this are more complex and will take time, and we need to pay as much attention to those as we're paying to the technical requirements. So I think that those were mine. So I'll hand back to you, Fergus, for you to decide where to throw the ball to next.
Well, I guess I can catch the ball and have a go and then pass it on. So in our group, and I want to maybe start with the second recommendation, because there was some good discussion there around high availability and disaster recovery, and coming to Jerry's point around, the utility of the public cloud there. It was interesting, that came up, but there was then the question about how does that work from a governance perspective, and if you, also from a legislation or jurisdiction perspective, if you've got data being stored on public cloud and it's then potentially not within the country and sitting in another jurisdiction somewhere, what does that mean in terms of the governance, in terms of the approvals, etc., for doing so? So that was a bit of a challenge that was raised around disaster recovery and the use of public cloud to do that. Just having a look quickly if I've missed anything there. There was also sort of the point around, is there, especially around high availability, is there a critical point in terms of the scale of the data where costs become, I guess, non-prohibitive? So there was a bit of a cost question around, can this really be done, and is there a scale or at which it's, I guess, more or less justified? So there was a little bit of discussion around that. Jumping to the first recommendation then around the reference architecture, I think there was general agreement that it's definitely needed, that it's a great idea. There was some concern around oversimplifying the idea. The term TRE in a box does make it sound like it's very easy. There was a bit of caution raised about making sure that it's clear that that's not an easy task, and that it really requires the capability and capacity underneath it to enable that. There was also the concern, again, a little bit of a capacity or capability concern around certain domains, more or less not prioritizing the capability to execute and manage this. So even with a reference architecture, certain domains, we had a colleague from NHS who sort of expressed this concern in the call around if the capacity and capability was really there to do it, even if you had it, even if you had the reference architecture. And then maybe, I think there wasn't too much discussion on recommendation 3. I think there was general agreement it's needed, but it was emphasized that it really needs to consider what's already being done. And it strongly emphasized that, you need to, I suppose to Jerry's point that he sort of already touched on, you need to bring everyone on board here, and it needs to be co-developed and co-created. And I think I'll probably end it there. Maybe the last point I'll say is on the recommendation 4 around the driver projects. There was the question really, or a lot of discussion was a bit about how wide is the scope really? And sensitive data is very, very broad. Commercially sensitive data, national security sort of sensitive data, personally sensitive data, and so it really needs to consider how broad is the question, and how broad are then the use cases by extension. Great. I hope I captured the main points from our group. I'll throw the ball to Hans-Erik.
Okay, thanks. I had a terrific discussion, or we had a terrific discussion in my bracket group too. So we covered a range of topics. Some were tightly coupled to this workshop and some were not. But if we look at, say, the recommendation number 1, develop reference architecture for TREs, this is where we discussed also the use of open cloud or public cloud rather, and there were some concerns raised that placing data in a cloud environment that is owned by, say, American corporations typically, what does that do for protection of data? And when we move data across geographic boundaries, international boundaries in particular, are there concerns there that we need to flag? And I guess that's always an issue, but there are ways to perhaps safeguard data. But nevertheless, these are real issues for trustworthiness, if nothing else. Maybe not from a technical perspective, but they are concerns of the public, and we need to be careful about that. I don't think that any of the recommendations that Jerry advanced here earlier were in any way controversial with our team. I think these are fairly self-explanatory from a technical perspective. It's mostly the concerns are about but the sort of the soft part of this, or the governance part, which are challenging, and we are of course well aware of that. There was a call for a software-defined infrastructure for TREs, so we can stand up and it's not dependent on the underlying hardware as much. This is a commonly raised argument for how we do define this TRE concept. There was an issue here of where we do disaster recovery, business continuity provisions, where we are moving data to, say, a third party for safekeeping, say Iron Mountain or similar environment where data is outside of the normal, say, data stewardship construct. It's not in a data center that you run yourself, and how that plays in from a regulatory perspective. Let's see here, most things you already raised here, but so they're in favor of, or we're in favor of developing community developed API methods. So there is a concern here raised that federated analytics and learning is crucial here, that it's can't be a sort of a re-centralization of this effort, that it has to be broadly community-based. And on the competitive call side, there's a question, can we tie this into various innovation programs that are already existing? Say the Digital Innovation Hub, Digital Solutions Program Hub, Social Care Digital Innovation Program, and the Hartree National Center for Digital Innovation. So there are a number of programs out there that we could perhaps tie into. We have also, quite frankly, spoken to NHS in their, that we just allocated £200 million for TRE work. So we are talking to them on an ongoing basis, and hopefully we can do something together. There is a concern that whatever we do, not introduce additional barriers to use by researchers, and also to understand how the environment works. One thing that was raised was having sort of catalogs of interoperable TREs where, say the API standards are similar or is very easy to interoperate. So we might need to sort of the cataloging of these environments is going to be important. And I'm going to stop there, and perhaps I can hand over to Lizzie.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so in my room, there was perhaps a little bit of skepticism about a couple of the recommendations, more just about their ambition, how difficult they might be to achieve. On the first recommendation, there was a view that the TRE in a box is an interesting idea, but there's also a governance piece around it in terms of when you give this to somebody to run on their own infrastructure, it's the people who run the infrastructure that are responsible when something goes wrong. So there's that sort of governance piece needed, and kind of a legal bit of work to sort there in addition to technical. And also there's a need for processes, governance processes to kind of be understood by computers as well. So crossing that kind of border between technical and governance framework. On recommendation 2, this is where there was a little bit of skepticism around whether this is something that should be prioritized. There's a lot of time wasted on data access, data cleaning, and so on. So are there easier wins essentially than high availability environments? Third recommendation. Sorry, just looking at the Jamboard here. There was a thought about making sure that you know what's done with DARE is kind of taken forward, that there aren't you know, exciting papers that are published that never actually come to fruition in real life. So there needs to be some leadership to kind of make sure that these things are pushed out across the sector. And there's a need for more money for business as usual in the same vein. Also, again, what's the scope of the API that we're looking at building? Are we trying to automate the building and access to new data silos? And also important that there was kind of discussion around making sure that we're not just building new things and that we're making use of what's already there and developing any new standards and initiatives, frameworks kind of on top of this and around that. And that disaster recovery APIs, etc., is kind of implemented over existing technology. And that it's important that we try not to fall down the trap of kind of just creating everything from scratch where possible. There are some things that obviously need a bit more of a starting approach. Recommendation 4, talking about test cases. It was seen to be that the selection process for these test cases is really important to make sure that to make sure that they work for the whole sector, that existing investments are not left out by technology that they can't keep up with. Essentially, it's got to work so that existing work doesn't get left behind, doesn't get wasted. Has to work to kind of improve what there is without leaving it behind. And then just more generally, something that's come up time and again across all the workshops, that this is a really hard piece of work that we're trying to do here. It's not all going to be quick wins. So thinking about what are quick wins and what is longer term and what we can kind of put in place to help those longer term goals get on their way. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And I guess just a note on somebody put in the chat about some of them are technical solutions, others are social, and that came up again yesterday, this idea of technical versus heart and minds. And I think that's absolutely key to everything that we're doing. We've also had a public dialogue, and it's clear that not only are the public reassured by the security processes in place for their data, but they're also surprised at how long and hard it all is. They actually want it to be streamlined. So kind of making sure that that social aspect is covered off as well is definitely something that we're really focused on. Great, I'll pass over to Michelle.
Thanks, Lizzie. So in our room, a lot of the topics that have already been covered or picked up on, certainly the fact that actually the technological side is not as difficult as the governance side was a point that was raised a number of times in our room. With regards to recommendation 1, people felt, yes, it would be a very useful recommendation to ensure that TREs are future-proofed and ready for federation. Although some did identify challenges with transitioning existing TREs to new standards that might be created and how that might be done. It was also identified that one size TRE would not fit all. So a data risk classification might be needed, and perhaps having one system, but with the ability to turn off and on certain controls depending on the tier of the data, or sensitivity of the data within the TRE. There was also a procedure to implement. Sorry, I've just had.
Michelle, I think we've got a bit of a bad connection. I think we've lost Michelle, have we? All right.
A notification that my internet's going up.
All right, Michelle, I think we've lost you, or we've semi-lost you. So maybe just in the interest of time as well, seeing as we're coming right up to 12 o'clock, maybe we'll just skip it. Apologies, Michelle. All right, so what we normally do, and we're a little bit short on time now, we're happy to stick around. So we would sort of just open the floor up for any kind of questions and comments. I think before opening the floor up, for those of you who do have a hard cut at 12, we just want to say thank you very much for being here. Thanks for giving us your time on this Thursday morning. And to some of you, thanks for joining us in a lot of our other workshops as well. It's been really great to have you here, and we really do appreciate it. It won't be the last time either, I'm sure, that we'll be speaking to each other. So thanks very much. Have a great rest of the week. For those who are staying for 10 minutes or so, we're going to be here. So please feel free. The floor is open. We can ask any questions or comment.